rot, decay, entropy. There are no other absolutes. To deny me is to deny those fundamental truths. To stall the inevitable. No matter the strength of will standing against me. The might of arms. Assembled and deployed. All will fall. The plague god cannot be denied, cannot be defeated, for he is the natural way of things. And there, end.
Among the legendary Space Marines, the Death Guard stands out as a chapter of hostility and defiance. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, unlike many of his brothers who either succumbed to corruption or felt a sense of neglect, expressed animosity toward the Imperium that was evident from the outset. His acceptance into the Emperor's fold raises critical questions about the Emperor's decision-making process and the implications of his choices for the future of the Imperium and its founding ideals. From the moment of his discovery, Mortarion displayed a deep-seated resentment toward the Imperium. Raised on the toxic world of Barbarus, future Death Guard warriors were molded by the harsh realities of its environment where death and decay were ever present. Their experiences instilled in them a profound disdain for weakness and a fascination with the grim aspects of existence. When the Emperor sought to unite humanity and establish a grand vision for the future, Mortarion's inherent distrust and hostility toward the Emperor's ideals foreshadowed the conflict that would later define the Death Guard. Death Guard's rebellion was not merely a product of their Primarch's upbringing, it was a reflection of their core belief. Future Space Marines saw the Imperium's reliance on the warp and the notion of psychic powers as weaknesses, and Mortarion rejected the Emperor's attempts to impose his vision upon him and his legion. In contrast to his brothers, who often sought validation and approval from the Emperor, Mortarion's fierce independence and resentment made him an outlier within the family of Primarchs. This was a man who embodied the concept of anti-heroism, believing in the strength of the individual above all else. The Emperor's choice to accept Mortarion and the Death Guard into the fold of the Great Crusade can be viewed through several lenses. Firstly, the Emperor's overarching strategy aimed to unify humanity across the stars, and this required the inclusion of all his sons, regardless of their dispositions. The Emperor believed in the potential for redemption and the ability to shape his sons into loyal servants of the Imperium. By accepting Mortarion, he perhaps hoped to guide him toward understanding the greater good that the Imperium represented. However, what did he do to change Mortarion's heart? Was the Emperor dedicated enough to this goal? And was the cost of failure to do so worth it? However, the inclusion of Mortarion and the Death Guard can be interpreted as a strategic necessity. With their unique abilities and resilience, the Death Guard could serve as a formidable force in the Emperor's grand campaign. Mortarion's acceptance into the Imperium, despite his hostile nature, could be seen as a calculated risk, an acknowledgement that even those who seemed opposed to the Emperor's vision could be valuable assets in the quest to unite humanity. In the end, the consequences of this decision proved dire. Death Guard's inability to fit into the Imperium's paradigm would manifest later, particularly during the Horus heresy. Mortarion's initial resistance to fully embrace the Emperor's vision laid the groundwork for his eventual corruption, and the transformation of the Death Guard into the servants of Chaos God Nurgle. The Emperor's acceptance of Mortarion did not quell his hostility. Rather, it allowed it to fester until it culminated in rebellion. In hindsight, many whisper that the Emperor just failed to recognize the underlying threats posed by his more volatile sons. While some Primarchs like Horus could be swayed through ambition and loyalty, Mortarion's character was marked by an intrinsic opposition to the very ideals the Emperor championed. The lack of foresight in bringing such a hostile figure into the fold ultimately contributed to the fragmentation of the imperium. In the embrace of great Nurgle, I am no longer afraid, for with his pestilential favour I have become that which I once feared, death. Culvein Hestarius of the Death Guard. The Death Guard stands as one of the traitor legions among the Chaos Space Marines. Their unwavering devotion is directed solely toward the Chaos god Nurgle, resulting in their transformation into Plague Marines, heretic Astartes who are perpetually decaying within their power armour, infected with a multitude of diseases and ailments yet impervious to pain and minor injuries. Originally established on Terra during the first founding, the 14th Legion was initially known as the Dusk Raiders. Upon reuniting with their Primarch Mortarion on the world of Barbarus, the Legion was renamed the Death Guard. This traitor legion embodies the power of Nurgle, the Chaos god associated with death, disease and despair, representing the very essence of all that this vile deity signifies. Their bodies are festering masses of filth and decay, eternally rotting while simultaneously being renewed through the relentless cycle of death and rebirth. Once, however, the Death Guard were the most formidable and resilient of the Emperor's Space Marine legions, created in the genetic likeness of Primarch Mortarion. Mortarion grew up on a harsh world where the human inhabitants lived in fear, cowering in the dark lowlands beneath the predatory gaze of their overlords, who resided in mountaintop fortresses shrouded in fog. Historical accounts do not clarify the true nature of these beings, but they were certainly more than human. They could breathe the noxious gases that comprised the atmosphere of Barbarus, which grew increasingly lethal at higher altitudes, and they possessed additional abilities. These abhorrent masters of Barbarus were capable of controlling the flesh of the deceased and preyed upon the terrified natives below, constantly in need of resources to sustain their perpetual wars. Mortarion was raised by one of these overlords, Nekare, the most powerful among them, who instructed him in the art of warfare, yet refused to disclose information about the people dwelling in the lowlands. When Mortarion ultimately defied his master and descended through the fog, an act he could achieve thanks to his superhuman physiology, he discovered individuals similar to himself, albeit weaker, and living in constant dread of their overlord's nightly hunts. Initially met with suspicion, Mortarion demonstrated his kinship with the lowland dwellers, rallying them into an army that first resisted the hunting parties of their oppressors and then turned the tide against them. In time, the only remaining overlord was Nekare, who retreated to heights within the toxic strata that even Mortarion could not reach. When the Emperor arrived on Barbarus, the inhabitants hailed him as their saviour. However, Mortarion felt a surge of jealousy and resentment toward the admiration lavished upon this perfect stranger. Although his people recognized the Emperor as Mortarion's sire, the Primarch could only see their differences. While the Emperor was noble and tanned, Mortarion appeared pale and gaunt. When Mortarion declined the Emperor's invitation to join him, the Master of Mankind issued a challenge. If Mortarion could defeat the last overlord of Barbarus, the Emperor would depart. If he failed, he would be compelled to accept his fate and join the Great Crusade. Mortarion accepted the Emperor's challenge and ascended into the noxious clouds, climbing higher than he had ever ventured before. Eventually he reached the grim stronghold of Nekare and demanded the High Overlord confront him. However, even Mortarion's superhuman form could not endure the toxic density of the atmosphere at such altitudes. As he began to succumb to its effects, Nekare prepared to deliver the final blow. In that moment, the Emperor appeared, stepping between Mortarion and the High Overlord, entirely impervious to the poisonous air surrounding them. With a single stroke of his blazing sword, the Emperor dispatched the last Overlord of Barbarus, compelling Mortarion to accept his fate. Yet, despite this victory, the Primarch was consumed by anger and resentment toward his gene-father for robbing him of what he believed to be his rightful vengeance. Once united with his legion, which was renamed the Death Guard in honor of the army Mortarion had once led against the overlords, it became clear that they were among the most steadfast and resilient of all the legions. Mortarion's warriors were consistently found at the forefront of battle, their indomitable spirit and determination a testament to their Primarch, making them the unyielding heart of any army engaged in galactic conquest. However, when the Horus heresy plunged the galaxy into civil strife, Mortarion aligned himself and his legion with the rebellion led by Warmaster Horus, driven by his unresolved fury toward the Emperor. On their way to the Siege of Terra, the warriors of the Death Guard became trapped in the warp, besieged by plagues of a malevolent origin so potent that even their legendary resilience could not withstand them. Soon, the entire legion was afflicted by a debilitating sickness that swelled their bellies with corpse gas, caused their flesh to slough away, and transformed these once mighty warriors into broken wretches ravaged by delirium. While the precise forces that influenced the soul of Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, remain shrouded in mystery, whether he was already damned or made his fateful pact in a fevered state, his cry for deliverance was undoubtedly answered. When the fleet of the Death Guard Legion finally emerged from the warp, both its vessels and its warriors had undergone a profound transformation. Gone was the once gleaming white and grey armour. It was now marred by filth, and the once noble warriors had become grotesque harbingers of death and abomination. The plague marines of the Death Guard had turned into vessels for the most virulent diseases that their new patron, the plague god Nurgle, could conjure. Condemned to an existence of eternal decay, the Death Guard were now destined to unleash their pestilent afflictions across the galaxy in the name of chaos. Following the conclusion of the Horus heresy, Mortarion guided his legion into the Eye of Terror. While many other factions splintered into numerous warbands, the Death Guard remained largely intact, a testament to their renowned strength and resilience. Mortarion led them to a world that would be known as the Plague Planet, reshaping it into a foul imitation of the lost Barbarus. To this day, Mortarion's Death Guard continue to launch their assaults through the Cadian Gate and into the galaxy beyond, sometimes as a formidable force and at other times bolstering allied chaos armies. Wherever they tread, they disseminate the joyful and exuberant poxes of Nurgle, bestowing the choicest blessings of the plague god upon those who seek eternal life. Numerous instances have been recorded where previously unknown plagues have swept through the defensive lines of otherwise static Imperial forces, followed mere solar hours later by a devastating enemy advance. Many within the Imperial High Command attribute these occurrences to the Death Guard, instilling a deep-seated fear of the vile diseases they might conjure next. The Emperor of Mankind endeavored to unify all of humanity under a single banner following the long night of the Age of Strife, aiming to put an end to interhuman conflict. Once united, his vision was to commence the next phase of his grand design, ensuring the supremacy of humanity within the Milky Way galaxy, a necessity he deemed crucial for survival against the relentless threats posed by chaos, countless Xenos races, and humanity's own frail nature. As the Emperor's gaze turned beyond Terra, he began to forge new armies to undertake his great crusade. These new forces were partially drawn from the contingents that had already united Terra during the unification wars of the late 30th millennium. To execute the Great Crusade and reunite all the scattered human colony worlds under the singular banner of the Imperium of Man, the Emperor created the genetically enhanced transhuman warriors known as the Space Marine Legions. These legions would serve as the spearhead of his Great Crusade, which commenced around the year 800th of the 30th millennium, spreading the light of the imperial truth and enforcing imperial compliance across every human world encountered. The origins of the Dusk Raiders can be traced back to the Unification Wars. The foundational human stock for most of the first Space Marine legions came from Terra, with the 14th Legion primarily recruiting its gene recruits from the ancient and warlike clans inhabiting the islands of Old Albia on the continent of Europa. The suitability of these people for induction into the ranks of the Space Marines was so pronounced that recruits were also drawn to fill the 8th and 10th Legions, the Night Lords and Iron Hands respectively, though to a lesser extent than the 14th Legion, which was shaped by the warlords and tech barbarians of Albia alongside the Emperor's influence. This recruitment served a dual purpose. First and foremost, it siphoned the strongest members from entire generations in a Terran realm that, while now an ally of the Imperium, was never entirely trusted. Old Albia, standing tall amidst the northern Atlan wilderness, had once posed a significant challenge to the Emperor's control over mankind's destiny. By incorporating their finest into the Legiones Astartes and other burgeoning imperial organizations destined for warfare among the stars, the Emperor effectively neutralized any potential internal threats to the unification. Secondly, this action integrated into the Emperor's forces the martial traditions and bloodlines that had long held Terra under a brutal yoke, ultimately overthrowing the Pan-Pacific Empire ruled by its unspeakable king, Nathan Doom. The relentless warlords and soldier scientists of this breed were a resource the Emperor was unwilling to squander. By the time the Unification Wars began, the warlord clans of Old Albia had shaken off the oppression of the last descendants of the unspeakable king and were reluctant to submit to the Emperor, refusing to exchange one master for another. Instead, the Albians met the Emperor's regiments of Thunder Warriors with their own battalions of steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts and heavily armoured Ironside soldiers. In battle after battle, the Unification forces struggled to advance, suffering staggering losses as the Albians steadfastly resisted the Imperial onslaught. Impressed by their martial spirit and unyielding bravery, the Emperor called for a ceasefire and sought victory over the warlord clans through diplomatic negotiations. He recognized that attempting to crush them by force alone would lead to a drawn-out war of attrition, decimating his own forces and yielding little more than ashes as a reward. The Emperor sought peace despite the objections of his human advisors and generals. It is said that he approached them unarmed and dressed in white and crimson, presenting his vision of a future where mankind would be reunited and ascendant, tyrants toppled and nightmares vanquished. He promised them glory among the stars and, most crucially, redemption for centuries of fratricide and bloodshed. To the astonishment of many, the warlords of Old Albia embraced the Emperor's vision. By doing so, the clans of Albia emerged as some of the most fervent supporters of the unification, even though they remained mistrusted by many. They contributed their warriors and shared secrets long guarded from the Emperor's gaze. Most significantly for humanity's future, the Albians offered their sons to become the first Space Marines. The 14th Legion quickly adapted tactics and warfare methods that would have been familiar to their Ironside ancestors. With a stoic demeanor and a gene-crafted aptitude, the Legion embodied the Emperor's design. Serving as heavy infantry, the Astartes of the 14th Legion became adept at survival and resilience, earning a reputation among other newly formed legions as relentless and disciplined combatants. In defense, they proved steadfast and unyielding, capable of withstanding heavy fire and holding their ground until the last warrior and bolter shell was expended. In offense, they systematically annihilated their targets, crashing into enemies in wave after wave of armored bodies, excelling in close-quarters firefights and bloody attrition. Their once grey and unadorned power armour began to bear insignia of rank and decoration, modified from the heraldic imagery of the Ironsides of Old Albia. Most notably, their right vambraces, gauntlets and shoulder plates were painted the deep crimson of dried blood, now signifying the red right hand of the Emperor's justice rather than the murderous reach of the Pan-Pacific Empire's unspeakable king. As the 14th Legion engaged in the final days of Terran unification and the initial battles of the Great Crusade off-world, they earned the epithet Dusk Raiders from their enemies, a title they proudly adopted. This name stemmed from their use of an ancient Albion tactic of launching major ground assaults at dusk, taking advantage of the shifting light to confuse enemy sentries while the gathering darkness masked their advance across open terrain. The reputation of the 14th Legion was such that foes facing an ultimatum from the Dusk Raiders often faltered, their soldiers panicking and abandoning their positions or throwing down their arms in flight at the approach of darkness rather than confront the Astartes. As relentless as they were in their assaults, the Dusk Raiders were also known for their sense of honor, adhering to agreements made for early surrenders and respecting symbols of truce. However, when such terms expired and destruction loomed, it was widely recognized that nothing could stay the Dusk Raiders' hand. This sense of honorable conduct extended only to human adversaries deemed worthy of being brought into the fold of imperial compliance. For the degenerate, mutant, or alien, no mercy would be shown. Thus, the Dusk Raiders persevered over the following 8 solar decades, unwavering in their commitment to the Great Crusade. Still without a father figure during this time, while other Space Marine legions were reunited with their long-lost Primarchs, leaving only a few undiscovered, this orphan status further cultivated a self-reliance and quiet pride in the Dusk Raiders' self-forged identity, with many enviable martial triumphs to their name. However, when their reunification with their Primarch finally occurred, it was not the joyous event many had anticipated. Instead, it cast a pall over the Legion, and under its shadow the Dusk Raiders were deconstructed and remade, leaving only the Death Guard behind. When the 20 gestating Primarchs of the Space Marine Legions were scattered across the galaxy through the warp, following a mysterious accident likely instigated by the ruinous powers of chaos, in the Emperor of Mankind's clandestine gene laboratory hidden beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, one of them landed on the planet Barbarus. This feral world was located in the Segmentum Tempestus. The inhabitants of Barbarus were divided into 2 factions: the ruling, seemingly Xenos overlords who were necromancers wielding formidable psychic abilities, and the human settlers, trapped on the planet millennia ago, forced to survive in the poison-free valleys below, while living in constant fear of the overlords and their undead and mutant minions. The Primarch child was discovered by the most powerful of these overlords, the High Overlord Nekare, among the corpses of a battlefield, where he wailed and screamed, defying the limits that would have claimed the life of an ordinary human infant long ago. Taking the child in with ambitions of raising a son and heir, the High Overlord named him Mortarion, Child of Death. Mortarion was confined within a fortress situated at the edge of his superhuman tolerance for the toxic air. Under Nekare's tutelage, Mortarion, who possessed a keen intellect and an insatiable thirst for knowledge, was schooled in everything from military doctrine to arcane secrets, and from engineering to tactical stratagems. As Mortarion grew, however, his inquiries began to delve into matters that the High Overlord wished to avoid, particularly regarding the unfortunate creatures in the valleys, whom the various overlords exploited for corpses to reanimate and bodies to corrupt. Ultimately, Mortarion realized he would not find the answers he sought from his adoptive father, and resolved to escape the fortress that had been both his sanctuary and his prison. He made this choice while attempting to save a caravan of humans being transported from the valleys to serve as subjects for Nekare's gruesome experiments. After dispatching several undead golem guards at the fortress gates, Mortarion, guided by one of those he had rescued, Callus-Typhon, ventured into the valleys of Barbarus. Breaking through the poisonous mists, he discovered that the Overlord's prey were indeed of the same species as he. Vowing to liberate them from their oppression, Mortarion sought to unite his kin against their tormentors. Initially, the people of Barbarus were hesitant to accept this pale, gaunt figure from the mountains, but Mortarion earned their trust when mutant creatures enslaved by a rival warlord attacked their village. Observing that the villagers were unable to mount an effective defense, Mortarion joined the fray, wielding a massive harvesting scythe that made quick work of the beasts. As Mortarion advanced on the warlord, the Overlord retreated into the safety of the toxic fog, only to be pursued and slaughtered by the inhumanly resilient Primarch. With his newfound acceptance among the villagers, Mortarion began to train them in the art of warfare. Soon, representatives from neighboring villages travelled to learn from him, and the scattered settlements across the valleys transformed into fortified strongholds. Mortarion travelled from one community to another, teaching, building and defending his people. He recruited the toughest and most resilient men and women he could find, forming them into small units that trained under his guidance. Collaborating with blacksmiths, craftsmen and artificers, He developed specialized suits of armor to enable his warriors to navigate the poisonous fog. With each battle fought amidst the mists, Mortarion and his Death Guard refined their armor and tactics, adapting to ascend the increasingly toxic heights. Ultimately, only one peak remained inaccessible to them, the mountain where Mortarion's adoptive father, Nekare, had established his lair. Despite the fact that his adoptive father was a merciless necromancer, Mortarion hesitated to attack the being who had taken him in and called off the planned assault. However, upon returning to the village, his mood soured when he discovered that instead of celebrating his victory, his people were discussing the arrival of a benevolent stranger who promised salvation for the inhabitants of Barbarus, the emperor of mankind. True to his oath, Mortarion knelt before his newfound father as soon as he'd sufficiently recovered, though his final act of defiance on Barbarus would leave enduring scars, both physical and mental, that would never fully heal. A formidable warlord in his own right, Mortarion was promptly appointed to command the 14th Legion, a force that carried his genetic legacy, and he did so on his own terms. As he gathered the troops before him, a grim, spectral figure cloaked and wielding the great black scythe that once belonged to his nightmarish foster father. It must have seemed to the Terran-born Dusk Raiders as though an ancient carved representation of the Grim Reaper had come to take the mantle of their new master. His message was straightforward and delivered in a harsh whisper, yet it resonated with each and every Astartes present. "You are my unbroken blades. You are the Death Guard. Through your hands shall justice be served, and doom shall follow 1,000 worlds." With this declaration, the Legion's name was officially changed, and Mortarion's words were engraved above the airlock of the battle barge Reaper's Scythe in honor of that pivotal moment. By this singular decree, the Dusk Raiders ceased to exist, and from that day onward the annals of history would record this new name, one destined to instill fear in the hearts of humanity's foes. Prior to Mortarion's arrival, the Astartes of the 14th Legion had been primarily Terran-born. However, after he took command, almost all new recruits were drawn from the feral world of Barbarus, starting with the young Callus Typhon, who had long served as Mortarion's chief lieutenant during his campaigns against the overlords and would now rise to become the Legion's first captain. This shift profoundly altered the culture and traditions of the Legion. By the twilight of the Great Crusade in the early 31st millennium, tensions began to mount between the Barbarus-born Astartes and the remaining Terran minority, who clung to the martial traditions of the Dusk Raiders that had their roots in Old Earth. These tensions came to a head in the lead-up to the first battle of the Horus heresy at Istvan III, when Mortarion assessed that roughly 1/3 of the Legion was likely to remain loyal to the Emperor as the Death Guard joined War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Imperium. Many of these loyalist Death Guard Astartes were Terrans, former Dusk Raiders, like Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Great Company, whose allegiance to the Emperor overshadowed their devotion to their Primarch. Say what you like about the 14th Legion. They are mean, ugly bastards, but tenacious. There's no one else I'd rather have by my side in a war of attrition, and almost anyone else I'd rather have against me. In Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands Legion, after the compliance of 1544, in the decades following the renaming of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard fought relentlessly in the service of the Great Crusade, unyielding in their battles beneath the watchful eye of their Primarch. With an unparalleled fervour, they pursued the liberation of humanity as never before. Their restless fleet traversed the cold void of space, moving from one campaign to another, resupplying on the go, and only pausing to engage in combat. The Death Guard did not fortify positions, nor did they build. They merely annihilated and slaughtered with a cold, determined efficiency akin to the relentless advance of a contagion or the crashing force of a tsunami, causing worlds to fall before them. Over time, Mortarion sculpted the beliefs and practices of the Death Guard, his convictions becoming a natural extension of their own. Their doctrines evolved into increasingly refined and radical tenets, centered on the unwavering resolve that humanity must be freed from oppression and terror. In Mortarion's mind, such liberation could only be achieved by destroying those who sought to shackle and devour mankind. This was a war to be fought without mercy, restraint, or hesitation. The battle for humanity's future required enduring any hardship, no matter how severe, and embracing any act, however brutal, in the pursuit of victory. To Mortarion, the ultimate aim of liberating mankind justified any means employed. Mortarion took command of his new army with a sense of stern authority. Although he remained cold and distant toward his sons, they revered him unquestioningly, adhering to his teachings with unwavering loyalty. Mortarion recognized in them an opportunity to continue the work he had begun on Barbarus. He sought to forge the Death Guard into the perfect infantry, adaptable and self-sufficient warriors, adept in the use of robust weaponry that was easy to maintain and resupply. The Death Guard learned to select the most advantageous terrain and then methodically grind down their enemies with massed infantry formations. They became the anvil to their allies' hammers, or the bludgeoning force that subdued their foes. Some of Mortarion's brother Primarchs derided his tactics as blunt and unimaginative. However, the doctrines of the Death Guard proved to be both durable and efficient, showcasing an exceptional talent for grassroots martial organization that resulted in a remarkable record of victories throughout the Great Crusade. Mortarion's gene seed imbued his sons with exceptional resilience. Through his rigorous regimens of toxin resistance and extreme environmental conditioning, the former Dusk Raiders became tougher than ever before. Their innate toughness only grew stronger, especially as Mortarion recruited the majority of his new legionaries from Barbarus. The Death Guard took pride in their indomitable physique, deploying into the most perilous war zones where even other Space Marines hesitated to tread. They extensively utilized rad and phosphex weapons, along with banned viral agents, which soon earned them a dark reputation among their brothers. Mortarion was indifferent to the distaste of his peers. His personal mission was to overthrow tyrants, those like the Carrion Lords of Barbarus, and he took pride in knowing his sons could wield their rugged strength to protect the defenseless. Yet for all their accomplishments, the efforts of the Death Guard largely went unacknowledged. Mortarion felt a closer kinship with his brother Horus than with his sire, the Emperor, convinced that the former appreciated his value far more than the latter ever would. Unfortunately, as they fought to shield the weak from oppression, the Death Guard became increasingly enamored with their own fortitude, growing dismissive of those deemed too weak to defend themselves. Decades of relentless warfare transformed the Death Guard, gradually diminishing the Terran influences within the Legion. The traditions and armaments of the Dusk Raiders were systematically replaced by the grim martial ethos of Barbarus. The bare, unpainted ceramite of the power armor favoured by Mortarion began to lose its embellishments, featuring only new murky jade markings reminiscent of the corrosive swamp mud that had once coated the iron plates of the human warriors who served the Primarch of Barbarus. Older heraldry and Terran influences were stripped away. The hierarchical structure based on Old Earth's War Masters was also abolished, and eventually the Legion's Librarius was disbanded due to Mortarion's aversion to sorcery, similar to that wielded by the detested Charnel Masters of Barbarus. Mortarion's influence was pervasive as he reshaped his Legion, from altering tactical doctrines to overseeing equipment procurement, and some say he even had a hand in selecting candidates and changing practices within the Legion's Apothecarian, where he had acquired the knowledge to intervene. Given the harsh conditions on Barbarus, and the foul entities likely still lurking in the planet's fog-laden mountains and deep swamps, there were murmurs suggesting that the remaining human population would have been better off if they had been euthanized or relocated to a cleaner world to preserve the sanity of future generations. However, Mortarion rejected this notion. Barbarus now belonged to his people, won through generations of bloodshed and terror, and its strongest sons would serve as recruits for his new Death Guard. As for the purely human Death Guard, who had once fought beside him against the overlords of Barbarus, many became the ruling elite of that world, forming a dread aristocracy, while the youngest and strongest underwent full or partial transformation into the Legiones Astartes, undeterred by the high fatality rates associated with late induction, seeing it as a minor price to pay for continued service under Mortarion, their saviour. In a short span of years, Barbarus evolved into a sort of factory, churning out new recruits for the Death Guard Legion. Meanwhile, the intake from other recruitment sources dwindled to a mere trickle unless battlefield casualties necessitated more personnel. Mortarion's reluctance to recruit from outside Barbarus only waned due to his desire to maintain the Legion's combat effectiveness. However, the hardy, feral population of the planet proved exceptionally suitable for the conversion process, with the Legion's gene seed enhancing their remarkable resilience to contagion and toxins to unprecedented levels. As fresh recruits from Barbarus joined the ranks, the surviving core of Terran blood dwindled, becoming a minority as the Great Crusade surged across the stars, with the Death Guard at the forefront of the fiercest conflicts imaginable. Although they may have ranked second in their father's eyes, the Terran contingent remained steadfast in the Legion, hardened veterans who were a formidable force. The focus on recruiting primarily from Barbarus drastically altered the Legion's culture and traditions. By the final days of the Great Crusade in the early 31st millennium, increasing tensions emerged between the Barbarus-born Astartes and the remaining Terran minority, who still remembered the Dusk Raiders' earlier martial traditions rooted in old terror. These tensions came to a head in the period leading up to the First Battle of the Horus Heresy at Istvan III, when Mortarion assessed that about one-third of the Legion would likely remain loyal to the Emperor as the Death Guard aligned with War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Imperium. Many of these loyalist Death Guard Astartes were Terran-born, former Dusk Raiders like Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Great Company, whose loyalty to the Emperor outweighed their allegiance to their Primarch. Mortarion believed that triumph in battle was achieved through sheer resilience, and Horus, adept at utilizing the strengths and weaknesses of the various legions to forge the most effective fighting force, frequently coordinated with Mortarion's legion. The Death Guard would lure the enemy and wear them down, paving the way for the Lunar Wolves to strike. This combat strategy proved remarkably effective, and as a result, Mortarion developed a close bond with Horus. The Lord of Death was a grim and determined Primarch, with his breathing apparatus and great scythe forming an inseparable part of his identity. The pale, hairless Primarch was often regarded as a freak by others, remaining distant from all his brother Primarchs except Horus and Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. Whispers circulated that Mortarion held greater loyalty to Horus than to the Emperor. However, the Emperor claimed that allegiance to Horus equated to loyalty to himself, as they were closely aligned. Events would later reveal the Emperor's grave misjudgment. When War Master Horus succumbed to chaos, it required little effort to drag Mortarion and his Death Guard Legion down with him. Horus had been one of the few Primarchs with whom Mortarion felt at ease, and thus he exhibited more loyalty to the War Master during the Great Crusade than to the Emperor himself. Adding to this dynamic, First Captain Callus Typhon, Mortarion's trusted lieutenant, had long been a secret adherent of the ruinous powers, eagerly steering the Death Guard toward the path of damnation. Mortarion revealed his true nature during the scouring of Istvan III, when he willingly sent potentially loyalist elements of the Death Guard, nearly one-third of his legion, into Horus's trap. Once the Astartes who remained loyal to the Emperor were purged, the Death Guard fought alongside their traitor brothers during the Dropsite massacre at Istvan V. In the subsequent assault on Terra itself, the Death Guard became part of Horus's invasion force. However, en route, the entire Death Guard fleet became ensnared in the Imperium due to First Captain Callus Typhon's actions, trapping them in a relentless nightmare. Earlier in the Great Crusade, while campaigning with the Word-Bearers Legion, Typhon had discovered an alternate path for the Legiones Astartes, a future where his hard-won but concealed psychic abilities would become a source of power, rather than a taboo to be hidden away. Erebus, the foremost chaplain of the Word-Bearers, initiated Typhon into the secrets of the Seven-Pillared Lodge, a warrior lodge based on the beliefs of the feral peoples of Davin that had begun to permeate the Space Marine legions in the later days of the Great Crusade. During this time, Typhon glimpsed what the Space Marines could truly achieve if they were to cast off the yoke of the Emperor's ambitions. Perhaps Typhon's revelation played a crucial role in Mortarion's own descent into the ruinous powers. Perhaps Mortarion would have found his way down this dark path regardless. Regardless, the troubled Primarch of the Death Guard saw a worthy master in Horus, while he viewed the Emperor merely as a self-serving, arrogant pretender who had usurped Mortarion's hard-won kingship over Barbarus in a single day. As Horus's heresy escalated into a galaxy-spanning civil war, Mortarion commanded his fleet to make all haste toward Terra, intending for the Death Guard to join the other traitor legions in the destruction of the false Emperor. By this point, Callous Typhon had pledged his loyalty to a single master, and it was not Mortarion. Typhon orchestrated the elimination of the fleet's navigators, fabricating a story that they were traitors receiving messages from Malcador, while assuring Mortarion that his psychic abilities would guide them safely through the Imperium. Though Mortarion despised the notion of relying on sorcery, he found himself with little choice. The Death Guard fleet entered the warp, condemning themselves to an eternity of warfare as pawns of a foul and ancient god. By leading the Death Guard into the warp, Typhon had effectively delivered them into the clutches of his new master, Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. The unpredictable currents of the Imperium are notoriously fickle, and during their journey, the entire Death Guard fleet became becalmed. As their ships drifted aimlessly, the insidious influence of Father Nurgle began to permeate their ranks. The Death Guard fell victim to the horrific infection of the Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's rot, as the foul power of Nurgle infiltrated the 14th Legion's vessels. It corrupted not only the mechanisms of the ships, but also the transhuman warriors within. Before long, grotesque fat flies buzzed through the increasingly oppressive miasma inside each warship, and wherever they bit the desperate Astartes trapped inside, flesh turned to putrefying jelly. The demon venom from their stings caused flesh to swell into grotesque new growths. Abdomens expanded and eyes ran like cracked eggs. Even their power armor began to meld and shift into bizarre new forms. Here the Death Guard's superhuman resilience turned against them, as they could not simply succumb to death. Instead, they underwent a slow, horrific transformation into Plague Marines, their souls claimed by Nurgle in exchange for a permanent escape from their agony. Callous Typhon, who had orchestrated this grand corruption, was rewarded above all. His form swelled, and his skin fused with his armor. Great funnels of pestilential bone erupted from his body, into which thousands of Nurgle's demon flies poured, gnawing at him from within until his decaying shell teemed with writhing life. Typhon became a vast hollow colony of disease-ridden insects. The bone structures protruding from his back spewed forth black decay as Nurgle's servants regurgitated the psychic energies coursing through the remnants of his herald's body. Thus, Typhus, Chaos Lord and host of the Destroyer Hive, was born, both the most blessed and the most cursed of his repulsive kin. Since that time, Typhus has unleashed 100,000 plagues upon the Imperium of Man. Among them, the Destroyer Plague is undoubtedly the most virulent, though its vector of demonic insects limits its effectiveness in infecting entire star systems. For Mortarion and the Death Guard Space Marines, nothing was more horrifying than witnessing the plague render their legendary resilience meaningless. The contagion spread through the fleet, roiling in their guts, causing their superhuman bodies to bloat and distort, transforming them into horrifying pustulant monstrosities. They became corrupted from within, repulsive to behold from without. With each passing minute they grew increasingly ill, their remarkable transhuman constitution turning into their worst enemy as their bodies resisted death, racked with the agony of their ghastly transformation. What they endured was unimaginable, with Mortarion suffering the most. Whether he realized during those dreadful hours the loss of his former ideals and the damnation he had brought upon himself and his legion remains known only to him. Unable to bear it any longer, Mortarion offered his soul and those of his sons to the Imperium, in exchange for deliverance from the eternal torment of the twisting corridors of warp space. A presence responded, as though it had been waiting. From the depths of the warp, the great god Nurgle, Lord of Decay and Father of Disease, claimed the Death Guard as his own. When the Death Guard fleet emerged from the warp into real space, they bore little resemblance to their former selves. The once resplendent ivory armor and jade heraldry of the proud Imperial champions were replaced by a sickly greenish pallor. The sleek forms of the Death Guard Astartes became bloated and corpulent, with every warrior now covered in boils, scabs, and putrescent sores. Maggots writhed in their unhealed wounds, and the air around them was thick with swarms of bloated black flies reeking of decay. Even their weapons and war machines had been mutated, now infused with the sickly sorcery of the plague god, glowing with a ghastly green warp energy and oozing rancid pus. The Death Guard had transformed into harbingers of pestilence. They had become the first plague marines. Mortarion himself underwent a transformation, growing taller and gaunter, as if stretched on a rack. In exchange for respite from the torments of the demonic plague, Nurgle had set him on the path to demonhood, reshaping Mortarion into Nurgle's greatest demonic servant, the Prince of Decay, the very embodiment of death. Condemned to a deathless existence of decay, the Death Guard would spread their pestilent diseases across the galaxy for the greater glory of chaos. Ultimately, Horus was defeated by the Emperor and cast down during the Siege of Terror. However, unlike the other legions, which splintered and fled into the Eye of Terror, Mortarion's legion conducted a disciplined withdrawal, force after force breaking against the superating warriors of the Death Guard. Mortarion led his forces back into the Eye of Terror in an organized formation. He claimed the demon world known as the Plague Planet as his new home, which proved to be an ideal base for launching attacks from the Eye into the material universe. He shaped it so effectively that Nurgle soon promoted him to become the greatest of his demon princes. Mortarion had finally achieved his desire, a world of his own. He ruled over a toxic death world filled with poison, horror, and misery. For better or worse, the Death Lord had come home. Some of Mortarion's sons embraced their new forms, believing in their arrogance that they had passed through the eye of the needle and proved themselves the only mortals worthy of Nurgle's favour. Others despised the plague that had brought them low, resenting the weakness it implied. For these warriors, only the complete ruin and sickness of the galaxy would suffice to bring all to their level. Still, others descended into madness, adopting aspects of wild glee or morose entropic despair. Regardless, the Death Guard had become Nurgle's servants, body and soul, for all eternity. In the millennia of war that followed, their devotion to their rancid deity would only deepen further. Within the Eye of Terror, Mortarion transformed the Plague Planet into a near replica of Barbarus, having assumed the role of its chief tyrant, a position once held by his adoptive father, Nekari. As of the 41st millennium, Mortarion remains alive, having recently re-emerged into real space for the first time since the heresy to spearhead the Death Guard's assaults on the realm of Ultramar during the Plague Wars of the era Indomitus. To this day, Mortarion's Death Guard continues to launch attacks through the Cadian Gate and into the wider galaxy, sometimes deploying in large formations and at other times reinforcing allied chaos forces. Wherever they venture, they disseminate the joyful and exuberant diseases of Nurgle, bestowing upon those who seek eternal life the finest of the plague god's blessings.